Hey guys, welcome back to another night of historical regret. If you're here, it probably means you can't sleep, and honestly, neither could most of the people we're about to talk about. So grab a blanket, maybe a questionable cup of medieval wine, and settle in. Tonight we're floating into the quiet, cold corners of old kingdoms, where assassins weren't sleek parkour experts in black cloaks. They were tired, hungry, and usually very bad at their jobs. Because, believe it or not, most medieval assassins were less mystery and dagger, and more dirt and desperation. Let's start by lowering our expectations. There were no secret guilds with dramatic Latin mottos, no flickering candlelit initiation ceremonies, and definitely no cool hidden blades. Most of these so-called assassins were just people. The kind of people who got thrown out of taverns, lost wars, or failed at being thieves. They lived in the corners of crumbling towns, sleeping next to rats who probably had more social status than they did. And when a noble needed someone removed, they'd find one of these forgotten souls and offer them a pouch of coins, or more often, the promise of one. Now, medieval contracts were never fair, but assassin contracts, downright suicidal. If you succeeded, you got paid less than a decent horse. If you failed, you were either burned, hanged, or had your insides rearranged in public while a priest prayed over you. And if you somehow survived both the job and your client's paranoia, congratulations, you were now a walking target. Because nobles hated loose ends, and you, my underfed, dagger-wielding friend, were the loosest end imaginable. Let's pause there, take a breath. Picture a smoky tavern somewhere near the edge of a half-frozen town. The walls are sticky, the air smells like regret and stew. A man in tattered boots sits alone, sharpening a knife that's more rust than metal. He's not a monster, just another soul trying to survive in a world that forgot him. This was the reality of assassination before it became romanticized in books and games. No glamour, no legacy, just exhaustion. Let's talk about the tools of the trade, because, spoiler alert, they were bad. A professional knight had a sword that gleamed. An assassin, he probably had a kitchen knife, maybe a bit of rope, or, if he was really fancy, some homebrewed poison that worked half the time and paralyzed him the other half. Poisons were the medieval version of winging it. You'd crush some herbs, mix them with animal bile, add a drop of something suspicious, whisper a prayer, and hope the result wasn't just salad dressing. And even if you managed to get your target to drink it, there was a good chance they'd just vomit dramatically for a few hours and then go back to yelling at their servants. But even worse than the tools were the disguises. Forget about shadowy hoods and sleek armor. Your average assassin looked like, well, your average peasant. Rags, mud, maybe a stolen cloak if they were feeling luxurious. Some even tried dressing as monks, but that often backfired when actual monks started asking questions like, "Brother, which monastery?" There's only so long you can fake being holy when you've got a knife in your sleeve and wine on your breath. Now, one might ask, why did they do it? Why risk everything for a few coins and a high chance of death? The short answer, they didn't have a choice. In a world without welfare, without steady work, and with wars happening every other Thursday, the line between mercenary and murderer was thinner than a medieval mattress. Some were ex-soldiers who couldn't go home. Others were peasants who'd lost their land. A few were just bitter men who figured, if the nobles kill each other for sport, why shouldn't I get paid for it? And that, dear listener, is how you ended up with an entire underground economy of desperation. Let's float over to one of the earliest known examples, the Hashashin of the Middle East. Yes, that's where the word assassin actually comes from. They were part of a sect that combined politics, faith, and strategic chaos. Basically, the medieval version of a very dedicated fan club with knives. But here's the twist. Even they weren't the sleek, silent killers legend made them out to be. Most of their assassinations were public acts meant to send messages, dramatic, theatrical, and often fatal for the assassin himself. Imagine volunteering for a mission where success and failure both meant death. That's not bravery, that's pure burnout. Back in Europe, things weren't much better. Every kingdom had its own brand of underpaid killers. The French had a flair for poisoning. The Italians preferred daggers and gossip. The English, well, they just outsourced everything to the Scots and hoped for the best. You might hear about noble conspiracies, royal murders, or mysterious deaths at banquets. But most of them came down to one desperate man, a bad plan, and an even worse escape route. And when things went wrong, which they usually did, the punishment was spectacularly creative. Public executions were the medieval version of a "don't try this at home" ad campaign. Hanging, drawing, quartering, all very effective ways to remind the audience that maybe picking up a side gig as a killer wasn't worth it. Now, if you think that's grim, just wait until you hear what happened when an assassin succeeded. They didn't retire. They didn't buy a house by the river and start farming turnips. No, they ran. They ran through forests, changed names, begged for shelter in strange towns, and lived in constant fear of a knock on the door. Because if there's one thing powerful people hate more than being assassinated, it's being reminded that they could have been. So our poor assassin would live out his final days in paranoia, probably talking to himself, clutching that same rusty knife, until history quietly forgot him. Let's be honest, that's kind of poetic in a very bleak way. The medieval assassin was a symptom of a broken world. He didn't seek glory. He sought rent money. He wasn't a shadowy hero in the night. He was just another man swallowed by it. And maybe that's what makes their story oddly human. So, as we drift toward the next part of our story, think about this. For every grand tale of kings, wars, and thrones, there were 100 forgotten people in the background trying to survive, and some of them, just for a handful of coins, picked up a blade and became history's quiet ghosts. Let's float deeper into that darkness, into the strange world of royal betrayals and the unlucky souls who carried them out. Hey, again, still awake? If so, that's impressive. By now, the candle's half melted, your tea's gone cold, and the world outside feels like a damp medieval dungeon. Perfect for the story we're about to slide into. Because while most assassins were nameless and broke, a few somehow managed to change the course of history, usually by stabbing someone slightly more important than usual. Royal assassinations were like political earthquakes in the Middle Ages, except slower, messier, and followed by 3 civil wars and a lot of confused cousins. Let's start with one of the classics, King Edward II of England. A man so unpopular, it's honestly surprising someone didn't finish him off sooner. Edward was, how do we put this gently, not built for medieval kingship. He preferred hanging out with his male favorites, throwing money at them and ignoring his angry nobles, which, in medieval politics, was basically speed-running your own downfall. His wife, Isabella of France, was not amused. She had power, beauty, and an allergy to incompetence. So when Edward's reign started collapsing faster than a wooden bridge in a storm, Isabella decided to do what every disappointed medieval queen eventually did. She started plotting. The plan was simple: overthrow her husband, install her son, and clean up the mess. So she partnered with a handsome rebel lord named Roger Mortimer, who became her close advisor. You can read between the lines. Together they invaded England in 1326. Edward fled. He was captured. And because medieval divorces were, well, complicated, Isabella just had him locked away. A year later, he was quietly murdered in captivity. Now, legend says the method involved a red-hot poker and a very undignified exit strategy. But historians think that story was just a medieval tabloid special, a juicy lie meant to humiliate his memory. In reality, he was probably smothered in his sleep, which is both sad and boring. The exact kind of thing we like here. Either way, the point stands. Isabella and her advisor ended up ruling England for a few years. Until, of course, they too were overthrown. Because in history, karma always travels first class. Let's float eastward now, to Italy, where betrayal was practically an art form. In 1478, the Pazzi family decided they'd had enough of the Medici clan running Florence like it was their personal theater. So they came up with a subtle plan to reclaim power. And by subtle, I mean assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother during Mass, inside the cathedral. Because if you're going to commit murder, apparently doing it in front of God was considered efficient multitasking. On April 26th, the conspirators attacked mid-sermon. Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed 19 times. Yes, someone counted. But Lorenzo survived, bleeding yet furious. The result? The entire city of Florence turned into an anti-Pazzi riot. Most of the conspirators were hanged from the windows of government buildings before dinner. Even the archbishop who joined in got executed. So, moral of the story, don't start an assassination during Mass. Bad optics. Meanwhile, in the north, the Scottish royal family was having its own brand of chaos. In 1437, King James I of Scotland found out that even royal blood doesn't stop sharp objects. After years of ruling with a heavy hand, raising taxes, crushing rebellions, and making enemies faster than he made friends, James was staying in Perth when a group of nobles decided they'd had enough. They broke into the monastery where he was sleeping. James tried to escape through a sewer tunnel, only to realize he had it sealed off years earlier to stop tennis balls from rolling in. Yes, tennis balls. He was cornered, stabbed multiple times, and left to die in what historians would later describe as a botched security situation, which is medieval historian language for someone definitely got fired. The assassins didn't live long enough to celebrate, of course. James's widow, Queen Joan Beaufort, went on a revenge spree that would make Shakespeare blush. One by one, the conspirators were caught, tortured, and displayed as royal warnings, proving once again that killing a king usually ended with everyone dead, not just him. Now let's drift to a chillier place, Russia. The 18th century court of Tsar Paul I was about as stable as a drunk horse on ice. Paul was the son of Catherine the Great, and unfortunately for him, not nearly as great. He was paranoid, impulsive, and deeply committed to making everyone miserable. By 1801, his nobles had reached their limit. A group of officers entered his bedroom one night, politely informed him that his reign was over, and then proceeded to strangle him with a silk scarf. The assassin's motto seemed to be, "If you're going to kill a czar, at least make it elegant." His son, Alexander I, took the throne the next day, acting shocked, though not that shocked. Apparently, no one in the palace was particularly broken up about it. You could say it was a quiet transition of power. Of course, royal betrayal wasn't just a man's game. History is packed with queens, courtiers, and mistresses who weaponized poison like it was an accessory. Take Lucretia Borgia, for example, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, and forever branded as the Poison Princess. Was she guilty? Probably not, but her family was so famously corrupt that she could have sneezed near someone who died, and people would have called it a calculated hit. Lucretia's real crime was being a woman in a family of scheming men. Her father and brother handled most of the dirty work, politically and literally. But centuries later, her name still shows up in every lazy assassin myth list, which just proves the power of medieval gossip. Meanwhile, in France, assassination was practically considered a sport by the 16th century. Let's talk about Henry III, a king who tried to balance between Catholic hardliners and Protestant reformers, and ended up pleasing absolutely no one. In 1589, a Dominican friar named Jacques Clément decided that God wanted him to personally handle the situation. So, he disguised himself as a messenger, approached the king, and stabbed him in the stomach with a knife hidden under his robe. The king, ever the drama queen, reportedly pulled out the knife, looked at his attackers, and said something along the lines of, "He's killed me. Kill him," which they immediately did. The friar was hacked to pieces on the spot. Henry lingered for a day, then died, officially ending the Valois dynasty and making room for the Bourbons, who, as we know, didn't exactly have smooth sailing either. Royal murders were, ironically, some of the few equal opportunities in medieval politics. Anyone could get killed: popes, queens, emperors, even bishops. In 999, Pope John XVI was mutilated by his enemies. In 1208, Peter of Castelnau, a papal legate, got assassinated by a knight, which kicked off the Albigensian Crusade. Basically, every time someone in power got stabbed, the church launched a war about it. It was like a very aggressive HR policy. But what's interesting isn't just how many royal assassinations happened, it's how normal they were. For every tragic ballad about fallen kings, there were dozens of political killings that barely made the parchment. Half of Europe's noble families were tangled in conspiracies, secret deals, or accidents that weren't very accidental. Sometimes the killers were heroes, sometimes they were scapegoats, and sometimes they were just hungry people with a job offer. The line between political necessity and murder was paper thin, and history usually picked whichever version made the winners look better. So when we imagine medieval assassins as elegant killers moving in candlelight, remember the truth was closer to mud, sweat, and paranoia. They didn't vanish into the night. They vanished into anonymity. And in a way, that's what makes them fascinating. Because for every crowned head that rolled, there was someone behind it, trembling, desperate, forgotten. And when the bards sang of glory, They never mentioned the man who did the dirty work. He slipped away into history's shadows. Not a villain, not a hero, just another tired soul doing the only thing he knew how to do. Hey again, still here? That's either dedication or you fell asleep an hour ago with autoplay on. Either way, I respect it. Tonight we drift east to ancient Macedon. The air's thick with incense, whispers of gods, and of course the faint sound of royal dysfunction echoing through marble halls. This is the story of Olympias, the original Don't Mess With Me queen, part priestess, part political hurricane, and mother to one very famous overachiever, Alexander the Great. Olympias was born around 375 BCE in Epirus, a place most Greeks politely ignored unless they needed a forest or a war elephant. Her family claimed descent from Achilles, which, in ancient politics, was basically saying, "We're dramatic, and we'll prove it." From early on, Olympias wasn't exactly the quiet type. She was deeply involved in cult worship, particularly of Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and questionable decisions. So yes, snakes, ecstatic rituals, midnight dances. She was into all of it. And when she met Philip II of Macedon, the future king, it wasn't exactly a rom-com. Philip was ambitious, loud, and perpetually surrounded by other women. Olympias was intelligent, spiritual, and, shall we say, emotionally intense. It was a match made in Olympus, or maybe in a particularly chaotic amphitheater. Their marriage began like most royal alliances, political convenience disguised as divine destiny. But soon their personal issues became the talk of the ancient world. Olympias didn't appreciate Philip's wandering eye, and Philip didn't appreciate Olympias performing snake rituals in the royal bedchamber. Yes, snakes. Real ones. She was often depicted with them, claiming they symbolized the god Zeus, visiting her in serpent form, and according to later stories, Alexander himself was conceived after one such visit. Was that true? Probably not. But it gave Alexander the kind of mythic PR boost every future conqueror dreams of. When Alexander was born in 356 BCE, Olympias instantly saw him as destiny incarnate. She told anyone who would listen that he was divine, marked for greatness. Philip, meanwhile, kept marrying more women and producing more potential heirs. So, you can imagine how that went. By the time Alexander hit his teenage years, the royal court was a soap opera. Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice, a much younger Macedonian noblewoman, and Olympias was furious. She left Macedon, taking Alexander with her, and started plotting. Because in royal history, when a queen storms off, someone's probably going to die. In 336 BCE, Philip II was assassinated at his daughter's wedding. Publicly, everyone blamed his bodyguard. Privately, people whispered about Olympias. The details remain murky. Maybe she ordered it, maybe she didn't. But within days, she returned to Macedon, burned Cleopatra's family alive, and made sure Alexander was crowned king. A mother's love, ancient edition. As Alexander marched across the known world, conquering everything from Persia to Egypt, Olympias stayed behind, running Macedon like a seasoned CEO of chaos. She wrote letters to her son filled with divine imagery, political advice, and occasional shade about his generals. When Alexander called himself a god, Olympias probably nodded and said, "Finally, he's listening." But power at home was fragile. The court was full of men who resented her influence, powerful regents who thought women should stay quiet and decorative. Olympias had other plans. when Alexander died suddenly in 323 BCE, likely from fever, possibly from poison, definitely from exhaustion. The empire he'd built crumbled almost instantly. And Olympias? She became the de facto guardian of his legacy. She claimed divine protection, rallied loyal troops, and positioned herself as protector of Alexander's infant son, Alexander IV. In other words, she went full political lioness. When rival generals tried to claim power, she struck back, not with diplomacy, but with executions. At one point, she had a rival's wife and children murdered right in front of him before ordering his death. Cold? Absolutely. Effective? Also yes. For a while, Olympias held control of Macedon through sheer force of will. But the thing about power, especially in ancient dynasties, is that it doesn't last long unless everyone's terrified of you. And fear fades fast. By 316 BCE, her enemies united under Cassander, a former ally turned ambitious warlord. He besieged Olympias' city. Her supporters, realizing that loyalty was inconvenient, abandoned her. She was captured. Cassander promised her a trial, which, in ancient terms, meant, "We're going to pretend this is legal." Her final moments were surprisingly quiet. According to one account, Cassander offered to spare her life if she renounced her claim and went into exile. She refused. Dignified to the end, Olympias faced execution without flinching. Her killers, reportedly the relatives of the men she'd executed, stoned her to death. Brutal, yes, but also fitting for someone who had spent a lifetime defying the limits placed on her. So what does Olympias leave behind, besides a few traumatized relatives and a son worshipped like a demigod? Legacy. Pure, ruthless legacy. She was one of the first royal women to wield real political power in the ancient world. Not behind the throne, but on it. She wasn't the scheming villain history once painted her as. She was a survivor in a world that had no space for powerful women. And she used every tool available, religion, fear, charisma, to protect her dynasty. If Alexander was a god on earth, Olympias was the one who built his altar. What makes her story oddly comforting in that sleepy, distant way is how familiar it feels. A mother fighting for her child, a court whispering in corners, power slipping through fingers no matter how tightly it's held. History repeats itself not because we forget it, but because it's always the same melody, just new instruments. And Olympias? She was one of the loudest players in that orchestra. Let's dim the torchlight for a moment. You can almost picture her, standing in a marble hall, incense curling around her face, eyes sharp as daggers, whispering to the gods she claimed as kin. Her name meant Sacred Mountain, and she lived up to it. Untouchable, towering, inevitable. But even mountains erode, and in the end all that remains is stone and memory. Hey again! If you're still awake after Olympias' serpentine bedtime story, impressive. If not, that's fine too. We're not here to stay alert. We're here to drift somewhere between archaeology and a nap. So, tonight, let's travel even further back. Before Alexander, before Rome, before the alphabet even figured itself out, there was Crete, home of the mysterious Minoans. The island that gave us the myth of the labyrinth, the Minotaur, and, of course, 1,000 confused archaeologists wondering, what were these people doing? Let's unearth it slowly. Picture it. Crete, around 2000 BCE. Palm trees, olive groves, seas bluer than royal jealousy. And rising in the middle of it all, a sprawling palace complex. Knossos, so big, so intricate, that when people rediscovered it thousands of years ago later, they thought it had to be the mythical labyrinth. And maybe it was. Because the Minoans weren't your typical Bronze Age neighbors. While the rest of Europe was busy hitting each other with bronze axes, the Minoans were busy painting dolphins on their walls and inventing indoor plumbing. Yes, showers. Actual plumbing. Centuries before most of humanity decided that water should flow inside houses, they had figured it out. So if you ever feel behind on home maintenance, just remember, a civilization that vanished 3,000 years ago had better bathrooms than most medieval castles. The Minoans were also oddly peaceful, at least compared to everyone else who owned swords. They built no massive walls, no city fortresses. They relied on their fleet and geography to keep them safe. Their art was graceful, fluid, all curves and motion. Dancers, bulls, sea life. No brutal war scenes, no divine smiting. They looked at chaos and said, "No thanks, we're going to paint some fish instead." But under that calm surface there was something else. Enter King Minos, the semi-mythical ruler of Crete, who gave his name to the entire civilization. If Greek mythology is to be believed, which it usually isn't, Minos was the son of Zeus and Europa. Zeus, of course, seduced Europa by turning into a bull, because apparently divine shape-shifting into livestock was his thing. From that union came Minos, part divine, part bureaucrat, and entirely obsessed with control. The story goes that Minos prayed to Poseidon for a perfect bull to sacrifice, and the gods sent one straight from the sea. Magnificent, gleaming, pure. But Minos, being a typical royal, thought, "Actually, I'll keep this one," so he sacrificed a random bull instead. Poseidon, not known for chill reactions, cursed Minos' wife Pasiphae to fall in love with the sea bull. Yes, that kind of love. Greek myths were imaginative, and from that union, and a little help from an inventor named Daedalus, who built a hollow wooden cow for logistical reasons we don't need to think about too hard, came the Minotaur, a creature half man, half bull, all tragedy. Now, logically, this entire story is a fever dream. But somewhere underneath the myth, there's truth. Archaeologists now think the story of the Minotaur might be a cultural echo, a distorted memory of bull rituals that the Minoans actually practiced. They were obsessed with bulls. Frescoes show athletes leaping over them in acrobatic displays. It was probably a religious ceremony, part sport, part offering, part "don't die." And it makes sense. If you lived in a culture surrounded by earthquakes and volcanoes, you'd want to believe that taming chaos, even symbolically, could keep the gods happy. So when the Greeks later told stories about a king building a labyrinth to imprison a bullman, they were probably remembering something real, a palace so complex and a ritual so strange that myth became the only language left to describe it. Now let's drift to the ruins themselves. Knossos wasn't one palace. It was a maze of rooms, hundreds of them, layered and winding. Storage chambers, frescoed halls, long corridors that doubled back on themselves. Sir Arthur Evans, the early 20th century archaeologist who excavated the site, was convinced he'd found the actual labyrinth. He even named the culture after Minos himself. Evans also, unfortunately, had the creative restraint of a toddler with finger paint. He restored Knossos using his imagination, filling in missing walls with bright modern colors and cement, essentially turning a 4,000-year-old ruin into an Edwardian art project. But still, through the modern reconstruction and questionable artistic choices, the soul of the place remains. You can almost hear footsteps echoing through the hall of double axes, see sunlight pouring through red pillars, smell olive oil stored in massive clay jars, each as tall as a man. The Minoans weren't just builders. They were dreamers with a serious flair for interior design. Religion for them was complicated. There were no temples like Egypt or Mesopotamia. Instead, worship happened in caves, on mountaintops, and in palace sanctuaries. And at the center of it all seems to have been a great goddess. Part Earth Mother, part Snake Handler, part Don't Mess With Me. Statues show her holding snakes in both hands, with eyes that suggest she's judging your entire existence. Some historians think she symbolized fertility and renewal. Others say she represented control over chaos. Maybe she was both. Because the Minoans balanced opposites beautifully, art and danger, beauty and fear. Even their architecture mirrors that balance. Light wells and dark corridors, open courtyards and hidden chambers, order built on the edge of confusion. And then, one day, it was gone. Around 1450 BCE, the Minoan civilization collapsed. Not with one grand invasion, but slowly, unevenly, like a candle guttering out. Maybe it was the eruption of the Thera volcano, which sent tsunamis crashing across the Aegean. Maybe it was the invading Mycenaeans, who came from mainland Greece and said, "Nice island, we'll take it." Maybe it was both. What's left are fragments, pottery shards, buried tablets, frescoes that still glow after 3,000 years. And of course, the myths, the only thing that truly survived, because when history fades, stories are what we keep. There's something hypnotic about the Minoans, their elegance, their mystery, their sudden disappearance. They feel like a dream the ancient world had and forgot to wake up from. And maybe that's what makes Knossos so haunting. It's not just ruins, it's the ghost of a civilization that once decided beauty was more important than conquest. They built not to dominate, but to delight. And that's probably why no one remembers their battles, only their art. Imagine it now. The palace lit by oil lamps, shadows dancing across crimson columns. Somewhere a flute plays, priests chant softly to the goddess, while acrobats flip over bulls in rhythmic defiance of gravity. And in the deepest part of the palace, the labyrinth breathes, not with monsters, but with memory. That's the kind of history that doesn't keep you awake. It lulls you. It whispers in the dark that once, long ago, people found peace in the patterns of chaos. And then, like all things, they vanished. Hey, again, if you're somehow still here, congratulations. You've survived the labyrinth. No minotaur, no crumbling palace, just you and the quiet hum of history still unfolding. Tonight, we're leaving the dusty ruins of Bronze Age Crete and drifting forward into marble halls, candlelit feasts, and whispered betrayals. Welcome to the Renaissance, a time when everyone was painting angels, writing poetry about virtue, and quietly poisoning their relatives for power. Because while the Renaissance gave us beauty, reason, and Michelangelo's abs sculpted in marble, it also gave us some of the most dysfunctional noble families to ever ruin Europe. And yes, I'm talking about them. Let's pour a metaphorical glass of wine, but maybe don't drink it, and settle into the story of the poisoned thrones of the Renaissance. It's the late 1400s. Italy isn't one country yet. It's a mosaic of city-states, each ruled by people who think they're gods but behave like soap opera villains. There's Florence, home of the arts and the banking Medici. There's Rome, technically run by the Pope, though at times it's more of a family business. And there's Venice, rich, scheming, and allergic to being conquered. Let's start with the Medici, because every Renaissance drama worth whispering about starts with them. The Medici family were bankers, which, in medieval terms, means they were either the most respected people in the room or the most cursed, depending on who you asked. They made their fortune lending money to kings and popes, and eventually, they decided to become both. Cosimo de' Medici was the one who really started it all. Soft-spoken, calculating, and the kind of man who could fund half of Florence and make the other half owe him favors. He played politics like chess, quietly, patiently, and always 5 moves ahead. Under him, Florence flourished. Artists, architects, scholars, all paid for by Medici gold. It's easy to picture the Renaissance as pure enlightenment, but let's be honest. It was sponsored chaos. Without rich families paying for frescoes and domes, we'd still be staring at stone walls and praying in Latin we didn't understand. Cosimo's motto was essentially, be powerful, but look humble. He never flaunted it, because in a city obsessed with liberty, being too obviously rich was bad for your health. But his descendants? They missed that memo entirely. Fast forward a few decades and meet Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo the Magnificent. He's what happens when a banker grows up, believing he's a poet king. He threw lavish parties, surrounded himself with geniuses like Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci, and occasionally tried to outsmart assassins during church services. Because yes, even worship was political. In 1478, the rival Pazzi family decided to solve their financial and civic frustrations by attempting to kill Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during Mass. It was messy. Literally, Giuliano didn't make it. But Lorenzo survived, partly because he was lucky, and partly because divine intervention apparently favored men with deep pockets. Afterward, Lorenzo calmly took over the city entirely. The Pazzi were executed, exiled, or both, depending on Lorenzo's mood. And Florence continued its golden age under a man who was equal parts patron saint of art and patron devil of manipulation. But let's drift south now, to Rome. Because if Florence was the brain of the Renaissance, Rome was its scandalous heart, beating with gold, ambition, and the occasional dose of holy corruption. Enter the Borgia family. Yes, those Borgias. If the Medicis were Renaissance elegance, the Borgias were Renaissance chaos with eyeliner. They came from Spain originally, and they didn't come to Rome to pray. They came to rule. The head of the family was Rodrigo Borgia, who eventually became Pope Alexander VI. He bribed his way into the papacy, of course, because why not? It's the 15th century, and God apparently accepted campaign donations. Rodrigo had children, several of them, which was, technically speaking, not supposed to happen when you're Pope. But Rodrigo didn't care for technicalities. His favorites were Cesare and Lucrezia, names that now sound like perfume brands but were once whispered in terror across Europe. Cesare Borgia was the prototype for the Renaissance supervillain, handsome, ruthless, and brilliant enough to make Machiavelli write The Prince about him. He had charm, charisma, and the moral compass of a drunk pigeon. Cesare believed in destiny, especially his own. He united parts of Italy under his control through a mix of war, diplomacy, and, occasionally, creative uses of the dinner table. Which brings us to the family's favorite topic, poison. The Borgia's reputation for poisoning everyone from rivals to inconvenient dinner guests became so legendary that Borgia banquet might as well have meant bring your own antidote. Historians still debate how much of it was true. Some of it was propaganda spread by their enemies, but it's fair to say they didn't have a spotless record. They allegedly used a substance called cantarella, a mysterious blend of arsenic and who knows what, rumored to be sweet-tasting and utterly deadly. The perfect Renaissance party favor. Lucretia, meanwhile, was often accused of slipping poison into wine herself. In reality, she was probably more victim than villain, used by her father and brother as a political pawn in arranged marriages that ended in sudden, suspicious deaths. But history, of course, loves to blame the woman. Cesare's story, like most Renaissance power trips, burned bright and ended abruptly. After his father, the Pope, died, Cesare's power vanished like incense smoke. He tried to hold on, but in Italy, power evaporates the second your bribes stop working. He died in 1507, young, handsome, and dramatically unrepentant. Lucretia outlived him, remarried, and eventually became the respectable Duchess of Ferrara. Which just proves sometimes the best revenge is surviving the family dinner. And just when you think that's peak dysfunction, France enters the chat. Because nothing says Renaissance melodrama like a royal family that considers poison part of its skincare routine. Meet Catherine de' Medici, Lorenzo's distant descendant, Queen of France, patron of astrologers, and walking embodiment of don't drink the wine. Catherine married into French royalty in 1533 and spent decades navigating the blood-soaked swamp that was French politics. She ruled behind the scenes, juggling wars, religious conflicts, and her children's endless incompetence. To survive in that court, you needed cunning, charm, and a working knowledge of toxins. Catherine allegedly had all three. Rumors swirled that she kept a flying squadron of ladies-in-waiting, spies disguised as seductresses, to extract secrets from noblemen. And of course that she used poison rings, perfumed gloves, and toxic cosmetics to handle problems discreetly. Most of it was probably gossip, but she didn't discourage it. In fact, it made her terrifying, and that was safer than being pitied. What makes all this so perfectly Renaissance is that everyone pretended to be civilized. They wrote sonnets, hosted salons, painted cherubs, and then spent the evening plotting how to discreetly eliminate their rivals with arsenic-laced pastries. It was an age of contradictions. Art and decay, love and cruelty, perfume and poison. You can almost imagine the candlelight reflecting off jeweled goblets as whispered laughter masks the sound of a rival collapsing into his soup. The Renaissance loved beauty, but it also loved control, and poison, in a way, was just an extension of that, the most elegant form of domination. Invisible, silent, precise. Unlike swords or wars, poison left no mess, just quiet, plausible death, the ultimate expression of Renaissance refinement. So, as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the marble halls of Florence or Rome, the echo of slippered footsteps, the rustle of silk, a golden chalice lifted in a toast, eyes meeting across the table, and somewhere, someone smiling just a little too kindly. That's the Renaissance for you. A masterpiece painted in wine, gilded in deceit, and signed in invisible ink. Because in the end, the Renaissance wasn't just about rebirth. It was about reinvention, even if that meant rewriting history, one poison drop at a time.